So almost 3 years ago, I bought this car for only €400, knowing very well that I wanted to modify it. And to this day, I still haven't addressed this horrible ride height. And that is on lowering springs. So this is definitely very overdue, but I have finally got coilovers. However, a quick Google search for K11 Micra coilovers will make you realize that the price of coilovers for this car isn't really cheap, especially considering that I paid €400 for this car. I did not want to be spending 2.5 times that on suspension. So this right here is a set of Corsa B coilovers. This video will pretty much be a full walkthrough of how I'm going to install these coilovers onto the Micra. So we're going to get straight to it. We're going to start off with the front suspension. Basically, we're going to be keeping the K11 Micra top mount and adapting it to fit onto the coilovers. We're going to start off by loosening and taking out the bottom 2 bolts, and I'm going to show you how to disassemble the front shock assembly without the need of a spring compressor. You can do it, but it doesn't mean you should try do it. But I'm going to do it. So we have taken out these bolts. They're pretty much ready to do that. Both of those are out. Brake line is unclipped. We are now going to take a 14mm, put it there, and first we're going to jack up the suspension. Right. So that is out. We are now going to release the jack from the suspension. I'm going to be very careful. It's basically all going to fall apart, but that is okay. Alright, and there we go. So you can see that the shock is no longer in the top mount and everything is fairly loose. So now we can go ahead and that's normal, and we have the shock and the spring all apart. So this is the Micra top mount for the suspension, and if we go over there, this is the stock setup. If you ignore the lowering springs, it's just a different spring really. This is the top mount, and this plastic thing here is the steering bearing. That sits into there, and just like that, the shock can spin when you're steering the car. So if we come over to the Corsa B coilovers, the first difference is that the tread here is an M12. This hole is a 10mm hole, so the first thing we're going to do is drill it out to be a 12mm, and then it should fit over onto there. However, the original steering bearing mounting surface is this bit right here. Now what we're going to do instead is use the integrated steering bearing on the Corsa B coilover, and we're going to use a 30mm precisely machined spacer, which is definitely not 13 washers welded together. This is going to go onto there, onto the steering bearing, and it will fit onto the original top mount just like that, and it's going to fit through the top hole. However, before we do that, we're going to also get a 12mm drill bit and make the bottom hole of the coilover mount to the knuckle slightly taller, because there's about a 2mm difference between the K11 Micra and the Corsa B mounting holes. So now that I've drilled out this side, I've fit it properly onto the knuckle, and I'm going to drill all the way through onto the other side. There we go. This hole did come out a bit more clean just because the drill bit had a guide at the front. That one's a bit messy, but it will do the job, and that one is actually fairly good. And now both of the bolts fit. So I've installed the top mount back into its original position just so it's in a sturdy place. So this is now a 12mm hole, and it fits onto the shaft of the shock. So this thick spring goes on at the bottom, and this one would usually go at the top. However, because it is very soft, I'm going to take it out and let the thick spring, the stiffer spring, do all of the work. Basically, I assume this will make the coilovers way stiffer than if that was in it. So that's what we're going to go for. Next up, we're going to take the top cup, put it onto here, and we're going to screw up the adjuster until the spring makes contact with that. Now that that's done, we're going to go ahead and install the 30mm spacer. If anyone's wondering, it's obviously a 12mm hole, and the outer diameter is 24, and it does fit there. And then we take this, and that right there is the coilover pretty much ready. I was just about able to fit this 18mm swan neck wrench in here and tighten the nut onto the shock. And now all there's left to do is screw that upwards, make sure it's all nice and tight using the coilover wrenches right there. And then this will be ready to go onto the car. So the spring is tight, those are tight, everything is set up here. That's done, it's back in place. All there's left to do is put back the 17mm bolts at the bottom and see whereabouts the center of the wheel would be sitting. So it's the second day of installing the coilovers, and we have done the passenger side of the car. However, we did something slightly different when installing this coilover. This is the coilover from the driver's side of the car, and this is the original dust cover for the front suspension. What we've done on the other side was cut this thick part off and use this rubber part instead of the spacer we have here. So now we have this rubber disc here, and we're going to place this onto the steering bearing instead of the spacer. It fits fairly alright onto the bearing itself, but there is a bit of movement in it, obviously. It does have a bit of a lip here that will kind of get it centered in there. So if we put this over onto there and then like that, I think we should be good to go. This way, the reason we're doing this is because the spacer would put all of the weight of the front suspension really onto that there. And when you put the car on the ground or have load on the suspension, this pushes out a lot. Over time, this might pop, so that is why we're going to go ahead and use this instead. So that's it all put back together. This is back in. The other side also is done. Now, we haven't addressed the fact that we will need to do an alignment, but we're going to do that at the very end. Also, these brake lines no longer have brackets to be secured to, so I'm either going to make something going from this bolt to there, or I'll figure something else out. But for now, let's go ahead and start working on the rear coilovers. So we're going to start off by jacking up the rear axle, which is currently on the axle stands, and we're going to move the axle stands onto the actual chassis and let the axle drop down. Right, should be alright. So obviously we're going to start off by taking out all the old stuff which we no longer need. So we're gonna remove the original shocks and fit the Corsa ones, which are shorter. So we got the Micra shock out, and this is the Corsa shock, which, let's see if that is a good bit shorter. So this is the Corsa B shock going into the Micra, and then we have this bushing, this washer, and the nut that is going to secure it just like that. So with the shocks mounted up top, we're now going to connect them to the axle. We did have to grind down each side to get them to fit in here, and also the hole in the bottom of the shock is a 10mm compared to the stock Micro one's a 12mm. So we have a 10mm bolt that's going to replace the original bolt. Right, so now that that's lined up, that should just go through there, maybe with a few taps, or not. We've mounted this shock fine to the rear axle, but I don't know why we did it, because we can't put the springs in now. So we're going to disconnect that. And speaking of the springs, so these here are the Corsa B springs, which might just fit. This rubber part here is another rubber part from the front shock dust covers, and we've cut it and made it look like that using some zip ties, because there is no bushing for the top of the springs. So we're going to see if that works. So here we have the bottom adjuster for the rear springs. I've pretty much maxed it out, and the original bottom bushing for the stock springs is actually the perfect size to go around this, just to center it in the spring cup. We are going to put this in there, and just like I've done on the other side, put the rear spring onto it, and we're now going to jack up the rear axle and connect it to the shocks. So we are jacking up the rear axle to connect the shocks. It's looking decent, but the only issue is that the springs are not centered in the top part of the spring cup. The only way to fix this would be to shorten this top arm along with the bottom one really, but to do that we're going to need to make adjustable arms, or buy adjustable arms. So that's one of the main problems with lowering your car. You can't just lower it and expect it to work perfectly, because you will need to, theoretically speaking, make adjustments to some of the suspension arms and linkages. For now we're going to connect the shocks, and like the car won't get driven for now, so it's going to be okay. and eventually, before this thing gets on the road, we are going to probably make our own adjustable suspension arms. So the rear springs and shocks are fitted, the front is done, one of the wheels is back on, the rest of the wheels are going to go back on now, and the car will go down on the ground for the first time with the coilovers on. Right, let's put it down on the ground. Holy moly, look at that. Over here at the front you can just about fit your fingers, and in the back you can't, which is definitely a bit of an issue. So the coilovers are fitted, but we are not done. I've taken the front wheels off and put the front of the car on jack stands, because if we come into here, I just want to double check the amount of preload we've put on each coilover and make sure that it's the same. The more we screw this upwards, the more preload there is on the spring. Preload being the amount of tension that there is on the spring before there is any load on the actual suspension, so preload. So I've screwed this up until we have about 90 millimeters of space between them. I'm now going to screw this one all the way up and pretty much lock it together onto the other one. I've done the same thing on the other side, and now I have put the front wheels on ramps, followed by the rear wheels also on ramps. And what I'm going to do now is go under the car, basically because we have load on the suspension, the wheels are on the ramps, we're now going to unscrew every bushing of the suspension and tighten it in this position. What I mean by that is they were tightened when the car was a bit higher, and now that we've lowered it, the angle at which, let's say, the wishbones are sitting isn't the same as before, and because of that there's a bit of a strain on the bushings now. I'm going to loosen all the bolts for the bushings and tighten them again in this position. So I have loosened all of the bolts for the bushings and tightened them back again. I have also adjusted the adjustable panhard rod, which is very sketchy, and I should probably make a new one. I'm going to do the same thing with those bolts holding the wishbone bushings. That is also done. Now, I don't know if you can tell, but anyway, the steering wheel is straight. However, the wheels aren't really. We are now trying to do a DIY alignment using this little string method here. We're using the track width of the car as a reference, and because that's narrower, we've taken that into account. So now this is our guideline, and we need to make sure that that part of the wheel and that part of the wheel is the same distance away from the string. So a bit of adjustment later, we have 40 centimeters from the wheel to the string here, 40 millimeters, and same thing over here, 40 millimeters. So that seems to be straight. We've done the same thing on the other side. This one is now also straight. I've also made two of these brackets that connect into a hose clamp, and I've bolted them onto here. Well, I've bolted one, and I'm going to do the same on the other side, and they hold the brake line in place, just because the coilovers didn't have a little bracket. So I've put the wheels back on, and here we have it. Finally, after a very lengthy process, the coilover install is finally done. So that is it for this video. We have successfully fitted Corsa B coilovers onto my K11 Micra. I hope this video has helped you out if you're considering doing this to your own K11 Micra, and maybe it's kind of shown you what to expect in the process. It definitely is a bit of a lengthy one. You know, you got to fit the coilovers, but it's not just that. You also got to look into all the suspension components, the bushings, retightening that, and obviously an alignment. Definitely don't do this if you're not going to get an adjustable panhard rod, because your rear axle is going to be all the way out very far. So you definitely need an adjustable panhard rod. The adjustable linkages in the back, not necessary, but I would recommend them. I would like to say a big shout out to this guy right here on the Micra forums. A lot of the things I looked up came from his forums on the Micra forums, and the info was very useful, so big shout out to him. He's also collaborated in this video right here. I put a link in the description. Fitting coilovers from a Corsa B to a K11 is definitely nothing new, but this has been my take on it. I've taken all the information I could find and showing you guys my experience doing it. So yeah, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you. So that's pretty much it for this video. I hope Oh, no, no. It's just too low in the back. It's actually undrivable.